Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you send us, could be articles, notes, research, and, well, we dig in together. We try to pull out the key insights.
Right. We're your guides, basically, helping
Yeah.
you get up to speed quickly, but without losing those fascinating details or the real core ideas.
Exactly. Think of it as us having a chat about some pretty dense stuff, trying to cut through it all to find what really matters and how it all fits together.
We're here to explore the landscape of the information you've given us.
Absolutely. And today, wow, we are jumping into a really fascinating deep dive. It's based on sources you shared, and it offers a very specific, very unique viewpoint.
Yeah, we're looking at human evolution, history, all through a kind of spiritual lens. It draws really heavily from lectures by Rudolf Steiner that you provided.
So this isn't your standard history class or, science lesson.
Not at all. These sources, they lay out a framework where you've got cosmic spiritual forces actively influencing human development, world events, even how we think and feel.
A reality behind the physical world we see.
Precisely. And our mission here in this deep dive is just to walk through this specific viewpoint, how it's presented in these sources, exploring concepts like, well, Lucifer, Ahriman, the role of Christ, and even a critique of modern science, all seen through this particular spiritual scientific perspective.
Okay, let's get into it then. So right at the heart of these sources is this idea that humanity, we're not just dealing with the physical world, we're caught in this constant tension, like a balancing act.
Between two really powerful cosmic forces.
And that's where Lucifer and Ahriman come in.
Exactly. And in this framework, they aren't just, symbols for good and evil. They're described as actual spiritual powers. They have distinct personalities almost in specific ways they influence us.
Okay, so tell us about Lucifer first. According to these sources, what's this force about?
Well, Lucifer is linked strongly with ancient wisdom, specifically pre-Christian wisdom. The sources trace Lucifer's big influence back to the 3rd millennium BC.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah, and they even make this claim, a really specific one, that there was an actual human incarnation of the Luciferic power in Asia around 3000 BC.
An incarnation, like a person embodying this force. That's quite something for a spiritual power.
It is, yeah, very concrete. And the sources describe the kind of wisdom that came from this influence as, well, primeval wisdom. Brilliant, insightful, yes, but, and this is key, it's described as cold, purely based on abstract ideas. It lacks warmth, lacks genuine feeling.
So like all head, no heart.
That's a good way to put it. Exactly. Lucifer is associated with imagination, pushing us towards individualized intelligence, a kind of cognitive independence, a desire to break free, to fly free from the limits of physical time and matter. Think, soaring intellect.
And where does this influence show up physically in us, according to this view?
Physically, they connect Lucifer to the head, the brain, the skull. The sources suggest this influence was actually crucial in shaping how the human head developed from earlier forms. It's the seat of that idea-based, colder wisdom.
Okay, the head, intellectual freedom. What else?
Lucifer is also linked to expansion, especially influencing something the sources call the ether body.
The ether body. Okay, quick explanation. What is that in this context?
Right, yeah. So in this spiritual science view, the ether body isn't physical. It's like a body of life forces, almost an invisible twin wrapped around our physical body. It's supposed to be responsible for growth, vitality, memory, that kind of thing. And Lucifer's influence, it expands this ether body.
Expands it. And how does that expansion feel or manifest?
Well, physically, it can apparently influence our breathing. It can lead to this excess vigor that the sources say can actually feel like you're being choked or strangled.
Whoa.
Yeah, but there's also a more subtle internal side, a feeling of inward oppression, they call it, tied to self-love or maybe spiritual pride, and a tendency to want to separate spirit completely from the material world.
So potentially a kind of suffocating pride or self-focus. That's quite an image.
It is. Lucifer is presented as the bearer of the light, bringing illumination. But, and this is crucial, he's not the light itself. His influence, while it brings wisdom and independence, it needs something else. It needs redemption, which these sources link specifically to developing loving duty.
Interesting.
He's also connected to revolutionary currents in society, and even, they say, linked to certain nature forces, like wind and weather.
Okay, so a force pushing towards intellectual independence, individual freedom, but with potential pitfalls of coldness, pride, separation from the physical world from others. Now, Ahriman is presented as the polar opposite, right?
Absolutely, total opposite. If Lucifer is about expansion, flying free, Ahriman is the force of contraction,
Hmm.
pulling consciousness down, intellectual compression into matter. He's grounded, you could say, maybe even trapped in the earthly realm.
And he wants to be king here, claim sovereignty.
Yes, exactly. Especially as humanity starts to understand the physical world without acknowledging the spiritual side. The sources call this a false gnosis. Ahriman thrives on that illusion, the idea that elemental matter is the only reality, and that physical life is, the absolute peak of existence.
Pure materialism, basically.
That's it. He aims to get us to discard the soul, the spiritual core, and just exalt the material body, our instincts, our impulses. And this Ahrimanic way of thinking, according to these sources, it leads to seeing humanity as nothing more than a completely developed animal.
A developed animal.
And they even specifically call out Darwin. They refer to him as, and I quote, a protege of Ahrimanic thinking.
Wow. Linking a major scientific figure like Darwin directly to a spiritual force like Ahriman, that's a really strong claim. It certainly shows how this framework connects things you wouldn't normally connect.
It definitely puts historical figures and scientific ideas into a very different context. Ahriman is also linked to the nerve process in us, described as cold, scornful, even bloodless. They compare him to Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust.
Ah, Mephistopheles, the cold, cynical intellect.
Right, and while Lucifer expands the ether body, Ahriman, in this view, can kind of sneak into a shrunken, dried-up ether body. The sources actually contrast confronting the Sphinx, which they link to Lucifer's influence on breathing, with confronting Mephistopheles links to Ahriman's nerves and intellect.
So Ahriman tempts us towards materialism, lies, illusions.
Yes, especially corrupting what they call the intellectual soul.
Okay, so here's a key difference maybe. Lucifer tempts with spiritual pride, wanting to pull spirit away from matter. Ahriman tempts with intellectual pride, leading us to get trapped in matter, seeing only the physical as real.
That really captures the core tension they describe. And the sources claim Ahriman is actively, skillfully preparing for his own physical incarnation on Earth.
Another incarnation. How's he supposedly doing that?
Well, they're quite specific. They say he uses humanity's disregard for truth and our intense focus on economics and banking. These are seen as key tools he uses to gather followers and influence events.
Economics and banking as tools for a cosmic spiritual force. That's a very specific and maybe unsettling way to look at modern society.
It really highlights how this perspective sees spiritual dynamics playing out in very concrete, worldly things.
Yeah.
Ahriman's also linked to certain nature forces like fire and earth, and associated with black magic, misusing the body's forces. He's even said to operate from specific deep layers within the earth, like the fire-earth stratum.
And geological events, earthquakes, volcanoes.
Connected, yes. They're described as, quote, echoes of the catastrophes linked both to Ahriman's own past karma and also to humanity's collective karma interacting with these deep earth forces.
So this is a huge picture. It connects spiritual forces, our psychology, intellectual history, economics, geology. It's all one big drama. And humans are stuck right in the middle.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that the core of human existence, our very being, is this constant effort to hold the balance between these two powerful opposing poles. We are effectively the battlefield.
Sounds like a tough spot. Is there anything according to these sources that helps humanity manage this constant push and pull?
Yes, there is. The central force they identify, the one that helps humanity maintain this crucial balance, particularly for us living today, is what they call the Christ impulse.
Right, but they also point out that as that older Luciferic influence faded, people found it harder to really grasp the Christ impulse properly, which led to, well, the rise of materialism, even creeping into religious thinking.
Exactly. They argued that just relying on the Gospels alone, the written text, isn't enough anymore. And going back to the old Luciferic gnosis, that ancient wisdom, that's not sufficient either for a genuine living understanding of Christ now. They claim that spiritual science is actually necessary for that deeper comprehension.
Okay, and this is where the sources get really specific about Christ's role, especially around the event known as the Mystery of Golgotha.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They describe Christ's death and resurrection not just as a historical religious event, but as a massive cosmic one, profoundly significant.
How so?
They claim that after his death, Christ descended into the realm of the shades, the afterlife, and, quote, cast Ahriman into fetters. Bound him, in a sense,
So limiting Ahriman's power.
Significantly, yes.
Mm.
According to these sources, this action mitigated some of Ahriman's most direct binding influence, although obviously his influence persists strongly, especially in the form of materialistic thinking that dominates so much today.
And they talk about Christ appearing again, not physically, though.
Yes, this is a really key idea in these sources,
Hmm.
the concept of the Etheric Christ. They claim Christ is reappearing on Earth, starting in the 20th century, not in a physical body like before, but as an etheric being.
Etheric. So in that life force body we talked about.
Exactly. They suggest this appearance will initially become perceptible to some people through a kind of natural developing clairvoyance and inner seeing. They frame this as a hugely important event for human culture and consciousness going forward.
The etheric Christ becoming visible to spiritual sight. How do the sources suggest someone prepares for that or understands it if it's not a physical thing?
It's complex. They introduce a concept they call the etherization of the blood.
Etherization of the blood.
Okay. It's described as a subtle process, happening particularly around the pineal gland area. It's where streams of influence coming down from the cosmos, specifically what they call the moral aesthetic impulse, can meet streams rising up from within the human being, the intellectual streams.
So connecting inner and outer stream.
Right. And spiritual science, they claim, can help fire up this connection, particularly between the heart and the brain. This makes the human organism capable, eventually, of truly comprehending this etheric Christ who is appearing now.
So it involves inner spiritual work and some kind of transformation of our physical processes, all linked by this spiritual knowledge.
That's the intricate picture they paint, yes. And they see Christ's influence as bringing constructive, unifying forces into human culture. They contrast this really sharply with a lot of modern building and culture, which they feel is based on fragmentation, destruction, even the destruction of light itself. They cite electricity as an example of breaking light down.
Why would destruction be part of this picture from their view?
Well, the sources propose that this destruction, especially of material forms, is actually necessary for the spiritual part of the earth itself to become free. It's seen as preparing the earth for a future cosmic state, which they refer to as the Jupiter embodiment.
Jupiter embodiment.
It places human and earth evolution within this vast multi-stage cosmic journey. It's a huge concept.
And how does Christ influence our inner moral nature?
He enables a fundamental shift towards unselfishness. Virtue, they suggest, becomes something that can be taught. Something lives from the inside out. They even project that in the future, people who are deeply immoral will be clearly perceived by others as being, quote, possessed by evil demons, specifically Ahrimanic or even deeper Esoteric forces, while others will naturally embody true morality.
Wow. They also mentioned the Maitreya Buddha. How does that fit in?
Right. They integrate figures from Eastern traditions, too. They claim that the Maitreya Buddha in a future incarnation will speak very significantly about the Christ impulse, and specifically mentions sons of fire. It suggests a future merging or dialogue between spiritual streams. They even go into details about the path of bodhisattvas becoming Buddhas, and mention a figure named Jeshu ben Pandira, about a century before Christ, as being on this lineage, but having received a deep Luciferic wisdom that needed purification by the Christ impulse later.
It seems the Christ impulse in this view wasn't just a one-time event at Golgotha. The sources talk about earlier interventions, sacrifices.
That's a really striking part of this whole picture, yeah. They describe Christ intervening at critical points in very early human evolution. He did this, they say, by, quote, ensouling an archangel, basically working through an archangel to prevent potential disasters that could have permanently messed up humanity's spiritual path.
Okay, what was the first one?
The first is described way back in the ancient, almost mythical Lemurian age. Christ's intervention then, they claim, stopped human senses from becoming inherently selfish. If that hadn't happened, just perceiving light or color, for instance, would have caused painful, self-absorbed sensations. They describe it like a painful suction or stabbing feeling. His action allowed us to perceive the world without being constantly aware of our own sensory apparatus, enabling selfless perception.
Wow. So first sacrifice, allowing selfless perception. What about the others?
Second intervention, described in the following Atlantean age. Here, Christ intervened again through an archangel to harmonize and balance our human vital organs, to prevent them from becoming selfish and causing constant illness. To be ill, in this specific view, is when an organ, quote, becomes selfish. His action allowed for selfless, healthy functioning.
Okay, second sacrifice, selfless organs enabling health. And the third?
Third, right at the very end of the Atlantean era, again ensouling an archangel. This time it was to harmonize human passion and thinking, which were becoming chaotic. This powerful act of overcoming these inner chaotic forces is symbolized, they say, by figures you find across cultures like St. George or Michael conquering the dragon.
Third sacrifice, harmonizing passion and thinking. So these cosmic forces, Lucifer and Ahriman, they have been shaping us for ages, and Christ has been stepping in at key moments to guide humanity towards balance and unselfishness.
That's the long view presented in these sources, yes. And the task for humanity now, they really stress this, is to consciously learn unselfishness, both in our moral actions and in our intellectual life, by striving for that understanding of not I, but Christ in me. And spiritual science, they believe, is the key that unlocks this living Christ and helps bridge that gap we perceive between the living and the dead.
That idea, bridging the living and the dead, that leads us into another area these sources really dig into, their perspective on modern science.
Yes, and they draw a very, very sharp contrast. They talk about the ancient understanding of the cosmos, seeing it as filled with spirit, soul, life, a living, breathing universe.
And modern science.
You say the modern scientific view has just stripped all that away. It sees the universe purely through mathematics and mechanics, like a great dead machine, quote, robbed of spirit, soul, even of life, something you only grasp with the intellect alone.
And the pioneers we usually celebrate, Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler.
In these sources, their contributions are described as bringing, quote, Luciferic constructions to humanity.
Luciferic constructions.
Yeah. They're not presented as discovering the ultimate objective truth about the cosmos. Rather, they brought forth necessary illusions. That's the word they use. Illusions needed for humanity's current stage of education.
Necessary illusions. That completely reframes the history of science, doesn't it?
It really does. And the sources make a crucial point here. They say, you must know modern science, know it exactly as it is, understand its math, its mechanics, but you have to do it with the full awareness that what you're grasping is an illusory aspect of reality. Something needed for our education right now, but definitely not the whole picture.
So the danger isn't engaging with science itself, but mistaking its findings for the only reality or the ultimate reality.
Exactly. They argue that avoiding science doesn't protect you from Ahriman's influence. In fact, recognizing its limitations, understanding its specific, somewhat illusory nature, that is how you guard against Ahriman.
And how does Ahriman use this modern scientific or intellectual way of reasoning, according to them?
Very effectively, they say. They claim this kind of reasoning can be used to, and I quote, prove anything and equally well prove its opposite, which leads to intellectual chaos, confusion. They even use the example of Marxist literature.
Oh, how so?
They say it's, quote, strictly proved within its own intellectual framework, and many people have, quote, fallen victim to it. While they argue no equally compelling intellectual proof exists for opposing viewpoints, which creates an imbalance. They see this as Ahriman using these intellectual methods to prepare the ground for his incarnation.
Okay, again, connecting a specific political economic ideology to these spiritual forces, but just reporting how it's presented in these sources we're looking at.
Exactly, that's how it's framed. The sources basically assert that true, deep knowledge has to be sought in a deeper layer of reality through spiritual science. Because mere intellectual proofs, which they say are only really valid within the limited sphere of natural science dealing with physical facts, they just can't grasp spiritual truth.
And they believe this materialistic science actually gets in the way of spiritual understanding, hinders it.
Fundamentally, yes. Its focus on purely physical processes, its, quote, countless illusions and fallacies, are seen as actively clouding our understanding of spiritual realities. It makes deeper occult investigation, as they call it, difficult. They state quite plainly that spiritual science is necessary to sweep away these materialistic superstitions.
Materialistic superstitions, that's turning the tables, isn't it? A strong counterclaim.
It is. They use this really vivid analogy. Materialistic scientists are like, quote, underground imps, just burrowing away beneath the surface of reality, studying material processes, but totally incapable of seeing the vast spiritual reality that's unfolding above ground. To know nothing of spiritual science, in this view, is to be trapped under the earth.
That analogy. Yeah, that sticks with you. They also mention a specific difficulty in trying to investigate the Earth's interior through spiritual means.
Yes, they describe it as one of the most challenging areas for spiritual investigation. And they link this difficulty partly to the hindrances created by the very focus and methods of modern materialistic science itself.
So it's not just that modern science is seen as limited. In this view, its whole approach, its worldview, actively obscures spiritual reality.
It presents a kind of hierarchy where spiritual knowledge is needed to correct and properly contextualize physical knowledge.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, these sources also offer a really unique spiritual take on broader human dynamics. Things like historical changes, power shifts, even the spiritual reality behind nationalities.
Yeah, they chart this fascinating spiritual evolution in who or what governs human society. They describe a shift from governance by actual initiates in ancient times, people with direct spiritual knowledge, then moving to priests, then after the Reformation and Renaissance, shifting to the economists, and finally emerging really clearly in the 19th century, the forces of banking and finance take over.
So political leaders, presidents, prime ministers, they aren't the real power brokers in this view.
The sources state it pretty directly. Rulers become merely, quote, understrappers of the economists. And by the 19th century, finance is said to, quote, swamp every other relationship. This rise of economic rulership, focused purely on material accumulation, is framed as a key way Ahriman uses to prepare the ground for his incarnation.
A spiritual interpretation of economic history and power that's consistent.
Exactly. And they also see modern political and social conflicts, like the constant opposition between left and right, as something that, quote, is utilized by Ahriman, used to create confusion, fragmentation, again, further preparing for his physical appearance.
What about the idea of spiritual dynamics behind different nationalities? That sounds incredibly complex and, frankly, potentially sensitive. How do they frame that?
It is complex. And yes, potentially sensitive. It's presented in these sources through the lens of how the idea or concept of nationality affects the ether body after death.
Affects the ether body.
Well, they suggest, for example, that for French people, or people from Romance language cultures, the strong sense of national identity keeps their ether body more formed, more cohesive, for a longer time after physical death. Whereas for Russians, they say, the idea of nationality is less fixed, more fluid, allowing the ether body to dissolve quicker after death, making it more, quote, vague.
And Central Europe in this picture. Germany, for instance.
It's seen as an intermediate state, less defined by nationality in that specific etheric sense, more characterized by an inner spiritual striving, which they connect to the tradition of mystics in that region, people who sought the divine within themselves.
And the sources explicitly link this spiritual difference between nationalities to actual physical conflicts like World War I.
Yes, they do. They present this spiritual dynamic as an underlying truth behind the external conflicts. For instance, they suggest that spiritually, Germany is like an anvil being hammered by forces from the East, represented by Russia, and the West, represented by France. Germany becomes the subject of their controversy in the spiritual realms, which is, they say, quote, quite different from what is happening in the physical world.
That's a very different way of looking at history. And they even make this really startling claim about physical alliances, sometimes being the opposite of alliances on the spiritual or astral plane.
Yes, that's a key point they make to illustrate the difference. They use the example of England and Russia being allies physically against Turkey during a certain period. But they claim on the astral plane, England and the Turks were actually allied against the Russians.
Wow.
It's presented as an illustration that the spiritual world can sometimes be an inversion, almost the opposite of the physical world, something that modern thinking might find, quote, grotesque, but is, they insist, quote, nevertheless the truth.
That is a profound claim that the physical world we see might be a reversed reflection of spiritual realities. And here's where it gets really, really interesting and quite poignant. This concept about soldiers killed in war.
This is one of the most moving parts in the material, I think. The sources claim that soldiers who die young in battle, whose physical lives are cut short prematurely, their ether bodies are preserved. They hold a large amount of unexpended life force, unused power, because those ether bodies were meant to sustain them for maybe decades longer.
And these preserved ether bodies, they have a purpose. They don't just dissipate.
No. According to these sources, these ether bodies of the war dead will, in future times of peace, quote, speak spiritual truths back to the living. They will send vibrations or sounds into the music of the spheres, proclaiming that, quote, there is more in the world than what mere physical eyes perceive.
So they communicate spiritually.
Yes. And the sources describe ignoring this potential communication from the dead, this potential wisdom, as humanity's, quote, greatest sin.
So the tragedy of war, in this very specific view, creates a kind of potential wellspring for future spiritual knowledge transmitted from those who passed on too soon.
That's the perspective offered, yes. And the sources emphasize that the so-called dead aren't just gone. They continue to actively work in the spiritual world for humanity. including, they say, contributing to the spiritual scientific field itself. The aspiration, they state, is for the living to learn to perceive and feel the presence of the dead among us, almost as if they were still physically alive.
They share an anecdote, don't they, about an anthroposophical colleague who died young.
Yes, they describe this colleague who died at 30, actively continuing his work in the spiritual scientific field after death, communicating spiritual truths back to those still living. The sources highlight how this was possible because the spiritual science movement itself, being seen as an expression of the living word of Christ, made it easier for souls transitioning between the worlds to connect and communicate spiritual reality back.
They also tell the story of a little boy, Theodore Face, who died tragically.
Yes, little Theodore. He died at age 7, hit by a furniture van. The sources use this incredibly sad event to illustrate concepts like karma and how a young, vital ether body full of unexpended powers enters the spiritual world. They also use it to distinguish between different kinds of cause and effect.
Oh, so?
For instance, comparing someone falling into water because they tripped over a rock that's an external physical cause versus someone falling into water because they had a heart attack that's seen as an internal karmic cause leading to the fall. They suggest the boy's death, tragic as it was driven by some deep karmic necessity related to his future potential and path.
These anecdotes, they really ground these abstract ideas in human experience, even tragic ones, while layering on these interpretations of karma and spiritual forces.
It's all about viewing the world through that specific lens, where spiritual forces, karmic connections, these are the fundamental realities shaping everything. Even personal tragedies, national conflicts, everything.
Okay, let's zoom back in now finally on the individual human being, our consciousness within this huge cosmic picture.
Right. The sources constantly come back to this. Man, the human being, is incredibly complex, a mirror image of the spiritual world itself, intimately connected to higher worlds, higher beings.
And how is our actual nature described beyond just being a physical body walking around?
They offer this really interesting idea that fundamentally, man isn't just a three-dimensional spatial form. We're more accurately described as a surface being or a plane positioned right in the middle of existence.
A plane?
Yes. And this plane, this surface, is the very battlefield for Lucifer and Ahriman. This central plane, they claim, is our true reality, much more so than the illusion of just being a spatial object.
A plane in the middle of the battlefield.
Exactly. And our physical right-left symmetry having 2 eyes, 2 ears, they even mention 2 hidden noses related to inner sensing. This symmetry is seen as crucial for developing our ego nature, our sense of I. It's the process of bringing together perceptions from the left side and the right side that allows the ego to fully inhabit this central surface plane. They even use the simple act of clasping your hands as a physical way to experience this union of left and right, this coming into the center.
So that internal struggle we talked about between Lucifer and Ahriman, it plays out in very specific ways within us on this plane.
It does. In our thinking, they influence a kind of left-right dynamic. In our feeling life, it's more of a before-behind dynamic. And in our willing, our actions, it's an above-below dynamic. And they stress our true soul life, thinking, feeling, willing, it happens on this central plane. It's not contained within the physical, spatial organism itself.
The sources also connect this struggle to movements in the etheric body.
Yes. Our feeling life, for example, is expressed in the etheric body as processes of hardening or dissolving. And specifically, Ahrimanic forces tend to harden the etheric body, make it rigid, while Lucifer's forces tend to dissolve it, make it diffuse.
They also mention concepts like initiation and certain times of the year being more favorable for spiritual experience.
Right. They talk about periods of what they call natural initiation, the time between December 25th and January 6th, the 12 holy nights. They say this is a period when the earth itself is deeply awake spiritually. This makes it naturally favorable for conscious spiritual ascent for inner work.
And summer?
Summer, conversely, is seen as a time of the earth's sleep, more conducive to older, more dreamlike forms of clairvoyance. They even point to the traditional birth date of Joan of Arc, January 6th, as a sign that she received a form of this natural initiation while still in the womb.
Another historical figure viewed through this specific spiritual framework.
Yes. And they note that while these natural initiations existed, conscious initiation, actively pursued through spiritual science, is becoming more and more necessary for modern humanity, as these natural windows perhaps become less accessible or we become less sensitive to them.
What about encountering nature spirits? Where does that fit in?
This, according to the sources, can happen when the etheric body becomes temporarily loosened from the physical body, maybe under unusual conditions, stress, or even just during sleep at night.
And when that happens?
When that happens, they say, one can perceive spiritual realities directly, including thoughts that might still be lingering in the etheric bodies of people who have recently died. Maybe a lingering thought about an unpaid debt is an example they give. And this ties into fairy tales.
Yeah.
How, yes, they suggest that the intense feelings people experience during these states, that powerful out-of-body sensation, the deep longing to get back into the physical body, and sometimes a sense of receiving help or guidance from elementary nature spirits, these are the fundamental spiritual experiences that actually underlie the creation and the enduring power of traditional fairy tales, or merchant as they call them.
That puts a whole different light on stories like Grimm's fairy tales. Finally, they describe the rose cross symbol in quite some detail.
Yes, it's a very important symbol for them. The roses placed upon a black cross. It's presented as representing the core task for humanity, revealing the spirit within the material world. It's about that constant striving to hold the balance between the two poles we've been discussing.
But the cross and roses together.
Right. The black cross alone represents inanimate matter, the pull towards death and pure materialism that's the Ahrimanic side. The roses alone, beautiful maybe, but detached from the cross, they symbolize a kind of selfish, spiritual striving, maybe escaping into spirituality, the Luciferic pull away from matter. Neither is complete on its own. The symbol is about the living spirit, the roses, integrating with, redeeming and transforming the material world, the cross, holding the balance.
Holding the balance. There it is again, that central theme running through everything. And the value of Anthroposophy, or spiritual science itself, is presented as absolutely crucial in this context.
Deeply crucial, yes. It's described as far more than just a theory or something for intellectual curiosity. It's presented as essential for life itself. A school of unselfishness, they call it.
A school of unselfishness.
Yeah, they claim it can give us mastery over our physical heredity, that it acts as a kind of therapy bringing health, and that it profoundly affects our experience after death. It enables spiritual perception, preventing what they call a kind of blindness in the spiritual world.
Preventing blindness after death. That's a strong claim.
It is. The idea is that preparing our spiritual vision is a task we have to undertake during earthly life. They also state that while spiritual science acknowledges and respects Eastern truths, like those concerning the Buddha, it uniquely illuminates the truths of Christianity in a way that is vital for modern humanity for our time.
And it's presented as being directly connected to Christ?
Yes, absolutely explicitly. It's described as bringing the, quote, living word of Christ into our time, opening the doors to perceive the living, etheric Christ, and empowering humanity to embody that unselfishness, not I, but Christ in me, in both our moral lives and our intellectual lives.
Wow. Okay. We have really taken a journey through a fascinating, incredibly complex, and sometimes challenging landscape presented in these sources. We've explored these cosmic forces, their influence on human evolution, consciousness, history, science, and the very specific, unique role they see for the Christ impulse and spiritual knowledge in navigating this whole picture.
It's definitely a perspective that weaves together almost every aspect of existence, personal, historical, cosmic, into a single, grand spiritual drama, where everything is interconnected and infused with a meaning that goes far beyond just the physical surface.
And the core message, the thread running through all these sources, as we've seen again and again, is that humanity's fundamental task is this constant effort towards balance, a balance between these powerful opposing forces, Lucifer and Ahriman. And it's a balance achieved not by accident, but through conscious spiritual effort, through knowledge, and through inner transformation.
It really offers a framework for viewing the world, not as just a collection of random events or purely material forces colliding, but as a stage for profound, ongoing spiritual interactions that are shaping everything we experience.
Understanding these spiritual dynamics as they're laid out in these sources, it certainly could profoundly change your perspective on the world, on other people, on historical events, on modern science, even on your own inner life, your thoughts, your feelings, your will.
It asks you to seriously consider that there might be powerful hidden realities actively shaping the physical world that we see and interact with every day.
So, based on digging into these sources, here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over as you go about your day. How might viewing the world, your relationships, even your own thoughts and feelings, through this specific lens, the lens of these interacting spiritual forces, Lucifer pushing for intellectual freedom and detachment, Ahriman pulling towards materialism and illusion, and the balancing power of Christ? How might that change your daily experience, your understanding? What happens when you start to look for the influence of those underground imps maybe affecting intellectual life around you? Or when you consciously try to place the roses of spiritual intention on the cross of material reality in your own actions in life?